Good morning, boys and girls. Today we're going to finish up our 3-day session on the introduction to World War I. On day number one, we talked about all the causes of World War I. We got to the immediate cause. Yesterday, we got introduced to how those causes came to fruition in the eyes of alliances and how everybody decided to declare war on everybody when it all went down. We talked about militarism and how the new technology, the advancements in weaponry, is really going to accelerate this war. And yesterday we finished with this slide, and the last thing we talked about was trench warfare, which is a focus of our lesson today. And then we're going to also talk about somebody in some country that we have not mentioned one time in this lesson, to your surprise. But let's start today with trench warfare. So fighting in the trenches was how World War I was fought. Now imagine up and down the Eastern Front and the Western Front, these 6 to 7 to 8 foot ditches and these trench systems all up and down the fronts for hundreds of miles and hundreds of yards east and west. In the top left-hand corner, you can see a diagram that shows you a typical trench system. Imagine that the Germans were on one side, and imagine that the British and the French were on the other side, for example, on the Western Front. Now, starting in the far left corner of the far left diagram, you can see an area called No Man's Land. No Man's Land was the area that was in between the two opposing trench systems. That was an area that you did not want to get into. You did not want to be there. Now, the only time that you were there is when you were attacking another opponent or your opponent's trench, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Notice in that top left diagram different names of the trenches. There's a frontline trench. There's communication trenches that connect trenches in reserve. They're reserve trenches. They're fire bays. You can see a company dugout for you baseball fans in the crowd. That's where your high-ranking officials would be. You would try to dodge mortar fire, and you would be underground hidden from the mortar shells and so on. Now, in the top right-hand corner, you can get kind of a good idea about what a soldier was like and on a firing step and how high he would be out above the trench. You didn't want to be above the trench. You had sniper fire. You had grenade launchers. You had all kinds of stuff that would be thrown at you. But you can get an idea about, what life was like there. Now, if you really want to get a nice visual of what life was like fighting in the trenches, you can look at the bottom right-hand image. Absolute misery. The soldiers on both sides complained totally about the conditions in the trenches. I'm not going to talk too much about that during this lesson because I'm going to go ahead and mention that at the end. We're going to do some stuff on trench warfare towards the end. As a result of fighting in the trenches for 4 years, World War I is sometimes called a war of attrition. A war of attrition is a slow wearing down process of one side in a battle or a war. And that's basically how World War I is going to play out. One side is basically going to run out of gas and lose World War I, and I can't tell you what side's going to lose because I don't want to ruin the surprise. Now, my favorite image on this slide and favorite thing usually to talk about on today is the image down to the bottom left. You can see that the soldiers hung up some of their prizes when they would hunt around the trenches. Now, you would think that those are cats. You would think that those are like beaver or badgers or something. Those are rats that are hanging up. And soldiers on both sides, after the war, during the war, completely complained about the rats, which they called trench rats, which they called corpse rats, which we'll talk about why they got those names in a second. But we'll leave the rats for a little bit later. Now, you can imagine that a couple years into this war, or immediately into the war basically, soldiers on both sides were not real happy about this type of fighting. So early on, morale is going to sink. Morale is how you feel about yourself. Now, when one of these kids would go to battle into war, the average age was somewhere probably around 20 to 25 once again. They'd be going with family members from their village. They'd be going to war with their best friend, and they'd be so fired up to fight with their countrymen for their country that when they finally got there, they got a big reality check, and they found out that the fighting in World War I was not really fun. Now, last night, you read about the Germans and how they went into a little Belgian town and attempted to make it a wilderness. The Germans did not help morale. They were killing civilians, they were killing livestock, and they did not make life for the Allies very well. Now, another thing that the Germans did was they were practicing something called unrestricted submarine warfare. And that's when they would blow up any ship that came into their waters or their sights, whether it was a military naval ship or whether it was a passenger ship. Now, the most feared vehicle of World War I was the German submarine. They were called U-boats, and you'd call them U-boats because the German word for submarine is Unterseebooten. but that's a mouthful, so we call them U-boats. Now the diagram to the right is going to show you shaded areas around Ireland, around England, off the coast of France, off the coast of Germany, in the Atlantic Ocean, and in the North Sea around 1915 that are German claims of where submarine ships were, where these U-boats were. And they were a thorn in the Allied side. Now, one group that we have not talked about yet is the Americans. Now, hopefully you were thinking that over the last couple days. When are we going to start talking about the Americans? I know that the United States fought in World War I, but why have we not talked about them yet? Well, in class, I would ask you that question. And a typical answer would be, well, most Americans thought that this was a European affair, so let the Europeans figure it out. And in 1914, there was still an Atlantic Ocean that separated the United States from Europe. So we were practicing something called isolationism. We were isolated from the event, we were isolated from the conflict, and we were not in a hurry to get over there and fight the Germans and fight the Central Powers. Now, one thing that's going to change our minds eventually are a couple of things. Now, first off, in 1914, 1/3 of the United States, the people that were living there, were immigrants. They were from German descent, they were from French descent, Irish descent, English descent. They had come over across the Atlantic Ocean and they had settled in the United States. So 1/3 of our nation were immigrants. Now, most Americans did not really care for the Germans. We read the stories about how they were killing civilians and livestock. We read the stories about how they went into the city in Belgium called the Louvain and made it a wilderness and so on. And the Americans did give pressure to our president. Now, the president of the United States during World War I is a guy named Woodrow Wilson. Now, Woodrow Wilson wasn't listening to it. He wasn't having it. In fact, he's going to sign a Neutrality Act shortly after World War I starts in 1914, on August 4th, 1914 to be exact, claiming our neutrality, which means we would not be fighting in World War I. We would not aid or help or support either side at the beginning of this war. Now, fast forward, we're going to go ahead and get the Americans to war today as well, and there are a couple of events in a couple of years after the war starts that are going to bring us into World War I. First off, there's a real famous British passenger ship called the Lusitania. Now, some of you might have heard of the Lusitania before, but it's one of those stories that you probably don't know where they fit into world history class. Well, on May 7th, 1915, this British passenger ship called the Lusitania, which made frequent trips across the Atlantic Ocean from England to New York City and back, is going to be sunk by a German U-boat, a German submarine off the coast of Ireland. Now, instantly, 1,260 people are going to die. But what does that have to do with the Americans? Well, here's the kicker. On the Lusitania, there was 128 Americans that died that day. Now, when this story came out, the American public was outraged. They went to President Wilson and said, this is enough. 128 of our people, our Americans, just died. We need to go to war. Well, President Wilson was practicing something called isolationism that we talked about a second ago, but he was also appeasing a little bit, the policy of appeasement, where you give in to demands in order to keep the peace. So he got on the phone with Germany and said, please stop blowing up our ships. 3 different times he urged the Germans to stop doing this, and the Germans kept doing it. So the president had no luck negotiating their way out of World War I. Now, the Germans had a plan. They felt like they could defeat the British before the Americans entered. So they were piling up on the Western Front and trying to defeat the French, trying to get to Paris, and trying to beat the British before the Americans would join this war. But the Germans wanted the Americans to join this war. And that's pretty evident because of one of my favorite stories of World War I. And it has to do something with the Zimmermann note, or you'll see it as the Zimmermann telegram. Now, this guy Zimmermann was a high-ranking official in the German government, and he's going to send a very famous telegram to officials in Mexico, urging the Mexicans to join the war on the German side. Now, the Germans promised Mexico that when they win this war, and we defeat the Allies with the Americans, you can have land back in Texas, you can have land back in Arizona, you can have land back. They made them all these promises. Now, this had major effects if the Mexicans were to join the German side. In class, I would ask you a question. What would be a major effect of this? Well, Overwhelmingly, your answer would be, well, Mexico borders the United States. And if Mexico is on Germany's side, the Germans can filter soldiers through Mexico into the United States, and now World War I is being fought on American soil. So the consequences of this were pretty extreme. Now, the best part of the story is that that telegram never got to the Mexicans. It was intercepted by the British, and the British immediately sent that letter to the Americans. And every American woke up the next day reading the newspaper about the Zimmerman note, the Zimmerman telegram, and the American public was outraged. President Wilson, you have to join this war. Now, the Allied powers are going to take a major blow in March of 1917 from the Russians, because the Russians are going to decide to go to war against themselves and fight a very famous civil war in Russia called the Russian Revolution. Now, this had devastating effects for the Allies, because now, with the Russians officially out of World War I, the Eastern Front is closed. No more fighting between Germany and Austria-Hungary to the east on the Eastern Front. So now the Central Powers could focus all their attention on the Western Front. And France and Britain were doomed. Please, Americans, join this war. Well, from March 16th to March 18th in that same year, 1917, 3 more American ships were sunk. And at that point, now listen, guys, this was 3 years into the war that these folks had been fighting in the trenches. But after 3 more American Navy ships were sunk in between March 16th and through the 18th of 1917, President Wilson had no choice but to declare war on Germany. And on April 6th of 1917, almost 3 years into the war, the Americans joined World War I by declaring war on Germany.